So, Tom, we had to welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you here for the second time. We did actually just get started a second ago, but we had to stop because a light was changing colour behind you, making it look a little bit like we're in some sort of disco.
Yeah, not a good one. It's like a bad 80s.
Bad 80s disco. We were also discussing before we started how just the difference of doing this in person. You were saying it's less nerve-wracking doing it in person.
Yeah, for some reason it's like for all the great things about Zoom and virtual meetings and all that kind of stuff. It's something about actually getting face to face with people that just, it feels a lot more natural and you can just get on with it. It's not as, something a bit more forced about.
Yeah, definitely. It's what we're designed for, isn't it? You're getting all the cues from the other person. You're seeing their expressions. You're just having a conversation with another person, whereas otherwise you feel like you're on video, although you are, I have to admit, on video right now. So we had a conversation, I think it was about a year ago now, where we talked about some of the stuff that you were interested in and looking at around services and kind of buying value in services. And it was a really interesting conversation. I've kind of been following what you've been doing on LinkedIn and places like that, where you're putting out some really interesting content. And I know when we spoke previously, you were talking about some of the ideas you had that might be working towards putting some of that content into like a book. And you just released a white paper recently, which I found really, really interesting, looking at innovation, basically, and contractor models, and specifically assessing time and materials approaches versus outcome or output-based approaches. What was it? What's the process that you're going through at the moment, and what kind of led to that white paper?
I had kind of grand ambitions of all this thinking that I've been doing around exactly what you're talking about, which is measuring value in service delivery, sort of the difference between how we buy goods and how we buy services. And I had a lot of content that was fleshed out and just in really raw, just not very well formed form. And I kind of had the idea that, eventually there's probably 30, 40,000 words here that I could put into a book. But to be honest, half of it's rubbish. So I was like, well, I'll strip that out. I'll take out, 6 or 7 pages worth, put that online, half of which I'd actually done because I was doing a master's degree anyway. And thought, well, I'll just kind of use the wisdom of the crowds to point me in the right direction. So I've got a few different ones kind of in the works. One's around, exactly. How do you form contracts to incentivize innovation between buyers and service providers? And then there's a few different topics I've got kind of lined up, all kind of around the same theme. But yeah, I mean, I kind of think a lot of the body of knowledge we've got in procurement is kind of coming out of 60 or 70 years of heavily kind of manufacturing driven supply chain management theory. And I think just given purely the volume and the weighting to services in most large global organizations and in most developed economies, I think in terms of services, we're a step or two behind. And we've got to figure out what are that best practice we can bring across to indirects and to services procurement, and what of it needs to be kind of created de novo. We were talking about, relational contracting and kind of advanced outsourcing models, things like that. But yeah, I've got to be honest, it's a complete work in progress, and it's kind of throw it at the wall and see what sticks and kind of course correct from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I think the idea of going through a series of white papers, breaking the content down, kind of, adjust your approach as you go, and as you say, take the feedback and build from that is a really good way to do it, because there's a lot to it. But I always love your content. I love the kind of academic approach to it and the very scientific approach to it. You bring in theories and concepts that certainly in some cases I haven't heard of before, and I find it really interesting and educational. And you're really delving into stuff, calling out really good questions and looking at it at a very strategic, sometimes theoretical level, but you also have the realism behind it. Obviously, you're a working practitioner. You're working at Mitie, So you're seeing what happens in the real world as well and applying it to it, which I don't quite know how you find the time to do it, but it's obviously a passion.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I kind of, I don't really find the time to do it. I just kind of put it together when and where I can. But yeah, as you say, I've come out of, over a decade of working specifically in outsourced services procurement, both in-house and in outsourced service organizations, specifically in FM. And so I've kind of, day to day, I kind of see the reality of how a lot of these contracts work, service performance and the lack thereof as well. So we've got procurement, FM procurement is full of brilliant people everywhere. And I think it's about, pulling together some of those real world experiences, but also realizing that, we don't know it all in procurement. And actually there's bringing together a lot of these ideas from not just business thinkers, but people in a variety of different fields, pulling them together.
Academics,
but also there's tons of stuff in consulting, and just in social media in general. You'll always find there's gold there to be mined. You just got to bring it together from different sources.
Yeah, I like the way you bring in certain things that are in kind of marketing theory and just broader business theory. There's something I want to come onto in a bit, which is a completely different type of theory, which you talk about within this white paper, which I find fascinating and a very interesting part of it. But let's just go back to the reason why this is important. Okay, so why should organizations be concerned with services?
Let me zoom way out. I'll give you my 50,000 foot view, and then steer me in the right direction.
Okay.
Going off on irrelevant.
I love a tangent.
So I'm going to go way back here, but according to the ancient historians, we basically spent 10,000 years up until the sort of medieval period working the farms. Everything's revolves around farmland, etc. You get into the medieval period, and you start seeing the emergence of trades that support local food production.
So you've gone from subsistence to more broader society-based agriculture, trades.
Yeah, but still, up until the start of the Industrial Revolution, it still revolves around really a subsistence economy. A feudal economy. We have a small subsection of society which controls most of the land, and then the majority of the people either work in the land or providing goods and services which support the work on the land, until you get the invention of steam technologies, and that starts to obviously to take off, and you start seeing, rather than small scale production, which your butchers, bakers, candlestick makers sort of thing, where production's heavily localized and supports local production, you start seeing the centralization of a lot of production because of the capital intensity required for that production. So you start seeing the emergence of factories, people start moving into the cities, and you see this explosion in the size of cities, but also the population density of urban areas. And then you get the emergence of coal, and then later oil. And so what you see in terms of businesses is sort of mass centralization, to the extent that Ford in the 1920s was so vertically integrated that he owned his own coal mines, he owned his own railroad, he owned freighters that were literally bringing coal up Lake Erie. So the most centralized possible. He owned the entire supply chain.
That's crazy when you think of it now, isn't it?
Yeah. And then you see sort of, as we get through the 20th century, and you kind of move from the industrial economy into the knowledge economy, where computing power becomes more important, you start seeing that centralization sort of move away, and you get, especially in the 80s, you start seeing the emergence of mass outsourcing, but also offshoring.
Yeah.
And technology enables that work to be done more and more outside the firm. The size of the firm shrinks, and so you get from someone like who's a good example, General Motors. They had at one point 300,000 employees. Compare that to Tesla today has about 70,000, and Facebook I think has got something like 40-50,000, but double or triple the market cap. So really what you're seeing is a sort of decentralization of the means of production, going into not just smaller and smaller scale firms that can specialize in certain activity, but increasingly now even individuals, which is, so you can get work done in a more fragmented way. And so what this means now is you get a move from the majority of GDP coming from the production of goods to now, in the UK and the US, we're about 80% now coming from services. But the challenge is, as I was saying earlier on, a lot of the best practices and a lot of the kind of value-add methodologies, Keiretsu, Lean, Six Sigma, coming out of Toyota and Motorola, they're heavily focused around manufacture of goods, because that's where most of the economic value is coming from. Whereas today, we're outsourcing more and more and more. 4/5 of the economy in the UK, at least, coming from services. We've got to realize that there is a value gap and there's a productivity gap in services that doesn't necessarily exist with goods. And yet we've got these organizations that are becoming more and more extended, and more work is being done outside the firm with specialists that are, outside of the walls of the firm. They're not necessarily, it's not just that they're not employees. They could be third parties, subcontractors of third parties, etc. And so the supply chain is getting longer and longer and more complex, not just in terms of raw materials to finished products, but raw services, if you like, to work being done that the firm cares about.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's risk and complexity in that, and it's a tremendous amount of value on the table that at the moment I don't think we're taking advantage of. So McKinsey did a study in 2016, 17, I think it was, where they estimated there's about $1 trillion of value in the Fortune 500 left on the table because of poor contract performance management. And so when you look at,
and that's going to be a large portion of that's going to be services.
Oh yeah, in fact, I think in their study, almost all of what they were talking about there was outsourced services. So you've got just a tremendous amount of value. I think it was 8-9% of their total service spend, they believe, is kind of left on the table because you haven't got the right kind of contract parameters within the agreement. You haven't got the right KPIs in place, etc. And so this kind of leads on to where I was going with the white paper is often we're outsourcing non-core functions within the firm to specialists that know how to do it properly. We don't have the right contract, not even the right contract terms, the right philosophy and governance around the contract that enables them to do that work, to produce the results we're looking for, the outcomes as opposed to outputs that are enabled by letting organizations do the work the way they know how to do best. So in Kate Fantastic's terminology, is determining what, not how, if you like. So that's kind of where I was going with this. Is how do we incentivize the innovation that bridges that gap to that 9%? So
it is absolutely fascinating. So when you're talking about the size of services and the importance of services and the growth of services, in the white paper, you describe it as kind of like a larger slice of an ever-increasing pie. But obviously you mentioned like the US, UK, economies like that are very heavily service-based at the moment, but most economies are moving more towards services generally across the globe. That's certainly a trend. And also when you look at the way that work gets delivered from the kind of very top level right down to individual level, that is also having a transition towards more outcome-based scenarios, whether it's the gig economy or whether it's outsourced consultancy or whatever it might be. So services are really important. They're a fundamental, critical part of what organizations do and what the services and what they procure. So they're massive. But I loved the fact you included in your white paper the IHIP definition. So do you want to just talk through that a little bit? Because working as a technology provider specifically within the services side of procurement, it's interesting because sometimes people will ask me, well, how do you define services, or what do you define as relevant to what the problem your product is trying to solve? The IHIP definition is quite a technical one, but there's some really good points in there. So you've got the intangible, heterogeneous, love a biological scientific term, inseparable and perishable. So on the intangible side of it, that's fairly clear. Most people appreciate that services are fairly intangible, which is where you get one of the big problems with services, which is defining them and obviously defining the contract and what's to be delivered. So services can be vague, or as you put it, nebulous.
Yeah, if you think about it, there's a spectrum between, if you think about a pure good on one side, which is a widget that you buy. You can go into Screwfix and buy a hammer. That's the procurement of a good in its purest form. Right through to if you get a haircut, to me that's a pure service. There's nothing tangible apart from
There's nothing tangible for me about having it. I can't believe you used that example.
Bad example.
That is so insensitive.
You can edit the file. But there's a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So in the sort of services marketing theory, you're talking about, right, in the purest form, those four factors. So the fact that it's intangible, the fact that you can't touch and feel services really. This grey area, but we can come on to that later. The fact that they're heterogeneous, meaning that it's very difficult to replicate services. You can think of 100 examples of this in our personal lives. It's very difficult to replicate services reliably over time because there's just so many different factors involved in the delivery of the service. There's the inseparability, meaning like services are co-created. So someone who's coming in to perform the service is usually in contact with the person who's experiencing the delivery of the service, if you like. So
we use the example of a hotel stay. It's a great example.
Yeah, hotel stay, music, like we usually, or comedians, they're providing a service, but the audience is in kind of inherently linked with the performance.
It's all happening at the same time.
Yeah.
The delivery of the service and the consumption of the service are happening simultaneously.
Exactly, yeah. So you can't store inventory, to use, to put my kind of supply chain hat on. You can't store inventory in a hotel quite as cleanly as you can, in accounting terms, as you can if you are, making screws that go into this table, because you can batch them up and store them in a warehouse and you can ship them out later on, whatever.
So that's the perishable element of it.
So that's the final part of that, which is the perishable elements. They can't be stored up. You can't, if you're, I won't use them.
Go for the hairdresser.
If you're a hairdresser, I can't store up 10 haircuts today and use them tomorrow. They have to be.
They're happening, yeah.
Produced at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is, and that's where, the difference between procurement of goods and materials versus the procurement of services. You were talking about how certain kind of like procurement organizational design and processes and procedures had been, or the whole buying architecture had been mainly set up around supply chain for goods and materials, like you say, from the kind of 80s onwards, when this procurement really started to come to the fore. Those kind of manufacturing principles and making everything organized. At the same time, the same thing happened within procurement technology, in the sense that when the ERP systems started to move towards becoming the kind of source to pay platforms, the same thing was the most important, and that was the procurement of goods and materials. Mm-hmm. So I would echo what you were saying about there being a gap around the management of services or the understanding of services within organizations. The same is true within technology, and the reasons are exactly those IHIP reasons. They're intangible. They're hard to define at the outset. They're heterogeneous. You can't just template everything. Every project's going to be different to a certain extent, which the fact that they're intangible and the fact that they're heterogeneous also has an impact on measuring them. Because, it's how can are you comparing apples with apples when you're actually trying to assess performance of suppliers, even if they're working in a particular category, because every project they work on is different. So you can't just say this project costs X and that project costs Y and make an assessment on it. The fact that they're inseparable and perishable, I feel, is more downstream around kind of the concepts of delivery and how you're managing those services. But from a technology point of view, the fact that they're intangible and heterogeneous creates significant problems, whereas goods aren't.
Yeah, you kind of got to think about the business case as well. So when ERP, MRP, the XRP, let's say, suite of technologies was first kind of formulated, we're talking like 50 years ago now, probably.
Yeah.
Something like that. But it comes out of complex manufacturing environments where you need technology to manage production processes from procurement of raw materials or work in progress through to a finished product that you're going to end up selling to market. That the business case for that is it's a lot simpler to make because goods are much more relatively
more binary.
Yeah, it's easier to define. You can get metrics around it that are a lot cleaner. But also then you're talking about a period where again production of goods and manufacturing was still kind of the core of you could kind of think back to like the sort of Detroit, it's the same in this country, in the Northeast and Wales with like the mining industry, etc. But even in the American context, like the kind of the heyday of automobile production in Detroit and all that kind of stuff. That business case is easier to make, and also what you're saying is it's difficult to capture the value add on getting the right specifications in place for service agreements and measuring performance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you could kind of get away with that until now, because I think now the value gap has sort of caught up to us, and we've got the data to prove it. Like the McKinsey study I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So I think it's almost like, and the technology is almost catching up to the point where we kind of understand the problem, and I think we're seeing technologies come to the fore that can help us solve that problem at just the right time.
Yeah, at the right time, where the evolution of the market means that organisations are starting to appreciate the problems in this area, and they're starting to look to try and address them. Whereas before, they wouldn't necessarily have been recognised, or they would just been seen as too complicated to try and solve. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So the other side of this, so we're looking at contracting mechanisms, but we're looking at them in the context of how do they foster and encourage innovation. So my first question for you is, how and why do you think that innovation happens within this kind of supplier buyer relationship?
Well, I think I kind of look at it from 2 points of view. It's there's innovation that's created within the contract itself and within the supplier relationship itself. So that's unique to that contract, and that comes as a result of the collaboration between the buyer and the supplier. But also, as I was kind of saying earlier on, is we typically outsource things that we either don't have the capacity or don't have the knowledge or the desire, as in the operating margin, to produce in-house. And so we outsource that to experts. It's those experts typically that have the know-how and the domain-specific expertise, the technology, the marketplace, whatever, to understand how to best deliver outcomes for clients. And it's more often than not, I think, it's buyers trying to define too tightly how services have to be delivered, as opposed to what the outcome they're looking to achieve is, which limits the innovation that you can get from a lot of those relationships. But the second part as well goes to, again, the relational contracting thing. Is if we're looking at creating value, there's kind of two different. I'll use value and innovation almost interchangeably, because we're looking, at the end of the day, that innovation has to have an end point, and that end point has to be better service delivery, customer satisfaction, reduced cost, whatever it is. So if we're looking at value creation, there's almost two ways that you can go. At least two ways you can go about it. So either you're looking at extracting value, which is probably the stereotype, I think an undeserved stereotype these days of what procurement actually does, which is launch an RFQ, tender out provision of goods and services, and then hammer down pricing until there's nothing left on the table, and it's very much a transactional win-loss engagement between the buyer and the supplier. The flip side of that is you say, right, no, we're going to look at this from a partnership, a small p partnership perspective, and say, right, rather than what's in it, I'm going to steal another Kate Tacit quote here, but rather than what's in it for me, it's what's in it for we. And this is, the example I think I listed in the white paper, and if I didn't, it's in the Harvard Business Review article that's linked there, is Dell and FedEx literally went through this evolution. So they had an outsourcing agreement where Dell was, increasingly frustrated. They were seeing costs spiraling out of control. They weren't able to perform to their SLAs, et cetera, and they moved to a model where they were saying, right, well, let's structure the agreement to allow FedEx to perform according to our SLAs, but in a way that allows them to take on risk in proportion with the way that the contract's structured. So the simple example in there is termination for convenience. They've got a termination for convenience clause in there. FedEx know that they can lose the business in 6 months, so they're not incentivized to invest in the contract and in the way that's in the long-term aims of both parties. So that's rather than what's in it for me, what's in it for we. But we're kind of getting into that's moving away from a single contract to a kind of philosophy around contract governance that's much broader.
That's getting into like a really developed relationship and that more kind of advanced setup. But ultimately, why you've kind of covered one of the points I was going to ask you, which is why do organisations want innovation? They don't want it for the sake of it. Some organisations are focused internally on innovation to come up with new products, for example. But in terms of having a service delivered, the purpose of innovation is to create more value, exactly as you said. There's no point in doing something wacky and wild and creative just for the sake of it. Ultimately, you're trying to deliver a better outcome when that innovation. So the idea of an outcome harnessing innovation, I can definitely see the rationale around that. So one of the things you mentioned was about contract design, but ultimately that comes back to what's incentivizing who. So when you talk about a kind of very restricted or prescriptive approach, that is basically just telling a supplier to do, very tightly controlled, do A, B, C, and D, rather than saying to the supplier, I want you to achieve this outcome. How you do it is up to you. It's a different mindset completely. And I think the interesting thing about this is it's quite scientific. Some of the stuff that you're writing about in this white paper, it's very scientific and there's a lot of theory behind it. But there's a decent amount of psychology and human behavior in there as well, which I think I find quite interesting. So organizations want innovation. Lots of organizations talk about innovation, but it's got to be fostered. It can't really be forced, which always makes me laugh when you think about this kind of like quarterly business review where it's the supplier's getting hammered for 55 minutes, and then the last 5 minutes, right, what innovation have you got for me? It's not really the fertile breeding ground for new ideas if they're being kind of put in the corner. So when you're looking at this in the white paper, you're looking at it in the context of that contractual design, and you're really addressing time and materials, or some people would say time and expenses, and looking at the impact that has on the motivations and the drivers of behaviour within that contract delivery mechanism. So can you just outline, firstly, why is time and materials so common? But also, what are the good sides and what are the bad sides as you see it?
I will say you're right in that a lot of this paper was kind of theoretical, kind of, I'm trying to put a kind of logical, scientific framework in place, if you like. But I see examples of this across now 3 different countries, 4 different industries I've worked in. So this is there's examples of this every single day.
It's real, basically.
Yeah. If you think about how this sort of outsourcing evolution took place, we're taking things that would originally have been done in-house and shifting them to a third party. So the units of measure for work being done in-house is usually an employment contract. If you're talking about services being performed by an individual or a group of individuals, you've got a certain amount that you pay them, you've got a certain number of hours they work, and that's a very simple methodology for calculating your cost inputs. You can also, obviously, you've got you could have different employee incentives. You can have different ways of targeting them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not an HR expert, but you can kind of imagine a lot of that stuff can be well controlled in-house. When you take that and outsource it, you're taking something that's easily measurable, because the only way to measure it really is on a time and materials basis in-house, and and then putting that onto a third party. So it's easy is the first answer to that. You can measure it in an ERP system the exact same way you would in the procurement of widgets, because you've got a very concrete way of measuring number of minutes or hours. In my case, maintenance is my area. So it's hours or minutes on site. It's a cost per unit of time. It's to some extent as simple as that. So that's the first part. The second thing is it kind of makes sense not to invest heavily in complex relational contracting, and the kind of things that will have a major payoff in large scale complex outsourcing agreements if what's being produced is relatively trivial.
Yeah.
So, you can kind of imagine relatively simple, low spend, low risk categories. In procurement, everything's always cost and risk. If you can kind of think about it in that kind of bottom left quadrant, if you like, it doesn't really make sense to invest heavily in reducing transaction costs and and making sure you're driving innovation, et cetera, et cetera. If someone's turning up for 15 minutes a month and it's costing you less than £1,000, you probably don't. It's not going to move the needle. So they're the two kind of big ones. It's simple, it's easy, and if something's relatively low risk, well, what's the point? The ROI is not there. Have I completely forgotten the second part of your question?
No. So the question was really around why is T&M so common? And I think it's interesting because I always think of it as like work delivery channels. You've got your permanent workforce, you've got the ability to bring in contractors and temp labour, which typically is, your time and materials, time and expenses. And then you've got the ability to do the variety of different outsourcing models where you are buying a service or an output or an outcome from a company that is providing that service. T&M as a go-to, as a get you started, dealing with a simple situation is the simplest way to do it. You're just measuring time. The other side to that is you don't know how much time it's going to take. So it comes on to I always think it's horses for courses, in the sense that in the right context of what it is you want to achieve. So like you were saying, if it's something really simple, is it really an area where there's a massive opportunity for innovation? It's a very simple, straightforward task. I think, as you said in the white paper, if I remember correctly, where the level of skill and knowledge within the buying organisation is similar to what they're buying in from a service provider, then you're really just buying extra capacity. So it makes sense in the right circumstances. It's not a question of this contracting model is always better than that contracting model. There's a time and a place for the particular modes of contracting. But as a default, I do feel like it's easy for companies to just adopt a time and materials mindset, because they feel comfortable. There's work being done, there's people doing it, and I know how much I'm paying per hour or per day, and I'm comfortable with that because they're not having to do the bigger thinking about how much is this going to cost in terms of total cost of ownership. What's the lifetime of this going to be versus what is it I want to achieve, and what's the actual outcome or outputs I'm after, which is a much bigger thought exercise at the beginning of the process. So effectively what you're saying makes sense in that there's no point in going through that big exercise and investing all of that if it's something very straightforward and the most effective way to do it is via time and materials. So there's always going to be absolutely a place for T&M.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why the title of the paper was How Time and Materials Contracts Hamper Innovation. Because if you don't need innovation in a given category or a given service line, time and materials is fine. It's only in areas where you really need innovation, and that innovation you're getting from the supplier is going to move the needle, that it's worth investing in complex relational outsourcing agreements. So, one example, let's say, right? So Transport for London, before the 2012 Olympics, they wanted to, they were going to have visitors coming from all around the world. It's just, massive showcase of London's, presence as a global city. And they wanted to make sure that the transportation network, the underground, the overground, everything that comes under the TfL umbrella was working to, was a symbol of London's kind of efficiency and modernity and whatever you like. So they brought in cubic transportation systems, which they manage, among other things, the turnstiles that you go through when you're in the underground. And they invested heavily in a true collaborative co-designed agreement, which had, I think that I was listening to a podcast with this case the other day. There was 95 odd different SLAs that they had to comply with, and so you've got an agreement there, which is it's of such high value to TfL as the client that to have uptime on as many different turnstiles and all the rest of the assets that are under management as possible during this time period, that it's worth getting a senior team of people together to collaborate and come up with a complex document that's going to be managed to a T. You're going to have a governance structure that involves both parties. It's going to be you're going to be overseeing that, and even to the extent that it was designed so that the team at Cubic Transportation Systems would have to sort of prioritize which SLAs they were going to meet at each time to give the greatest payoff to them and TfL, because they couldn't meet both of them at the same time.
But that was down to them to prioritize that.
Yeah, exactly. But it's the contract's designed so that they have trust in the partner there to make the right decision at the right time. So that's I think a beautiful example of, you've got high risk, really high amount of value in delivering that contract right. It's going to have a massive payoff, not just for TfL, but for the whole country. It's a huge once in a lifetime event. And so that's something which rewards investing in the contract and driving innovation off the back of it. But that's obviously on the far end of that spectrum. Yeah, but it could be 80% of the things we come in contact with, the Pareto rule, 80% probably is a minority of what we're actually spending on, and a minority of risk. And so in those cases, it's much simpler to draw up a contract which is based on inputs rather than outputs or even outcomes. And so, in many, many cases, the time and materials contract is perfectly sufficient for the needs that you have.
Yeah, and I think you talk about this scale within the white paper. I think I can't remember whether you had a graph on this or not, but basically there is this scale that goes low complexity to high complexity of what it is you're doing, and versus the value in investing at the contract design stage and really understanding what it is you want to do before you get into it. I see that a lot. It's interesting. You also mentioned this concept of kind of like a halfway house where people get a bit stuck. Do you want to just kind of explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, that's what I think you see in practice more often than not. Is you've got a contract which was initially designed for time and materials. You might have some SLAs on the back of it, so you've got some performance criteria for the supplier, but ultimately you've still got the risk, the cost risk, sitting with the buyer. So you've got, if you've got a time and materials agreement, the supplier is to a certain extent incentivized to bill you as much as they possibly can. Yeah. I mean, in practice, does that happen? No. Usually you've got a little bit more faith and trust in that between the parties, but the incentive is there.
I think a lot of people would argue it does.
I'm trying to be diplomatic and careful. I'm picking my but you've got exactly the scenario you're talking about, where you've got a time and materials agreement with a supplier that you may consider strategic. They might be, performing a strategic service for you. And yet on paper, you've got an agreement which incentivizes them to overbill you. And then every quarter you sit down with them and wonder why you're not able to drive service efficiencies, greater performance against pre-agreed KPIs, whatever it is, because you've got a tension between what you've got on paper and what you're actually trying to achieve.
So you've got a misalignment of expectations in the sense that the buyer is expecting an outcome and the supplier is being basically leveraged on a time metric, which doesn't incentivize them towards an outcome.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that comes down to that there's not enough trust in the relationship yet. There's not enough investment in developing a trusted relationship between the buyer and the supplier. So the buyer can't release the control they've got over billing at an invoice level. They can't relinquish that trust to perform to pre-agreed outcomes. So you see it. I mean, even like a lot of PFI contracts, you see they, you might have that outsourced wholesale to a third party, but all you've done then is shift all the risk onto the outsourcing provider. That's not necessarily what Kate Vitasic's talking about there, which is a truly collaborative agreement, which is designed to meet the objectives of both parties. You can't outsource risk. Effectively, you can do, but you've got to realize that all it does is shift the risk elsewhere in the supply chain. It still exists. You just push it outside. What you want to do is collaboratively work together to make sure you're meeting the outcomes you're looking for from the end user's standpoint, or from whoever controls that budget at the end of the day, with an efficient use of resources. And that's where the value for money, the cost saving element comes into it. It's not by hammering down the cost per unit of time or the total amount of time involved in the contract. That's a win-lose scenario that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it kind of has parallels in an individual level of work. So if we look at the outsourced service provider, scale that right down to them being an individual, you bring in an individual to advise you on something, and then you just tell them what to do. So I'm going to pay you, £100 an hour, and I want you to do this, 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 and this. Whereas if you said to them, I'll pay you 10K and I want you to solve this problem, then they then have the opportunity to use an innovative approach to make it as valuable for them as possible. But you're getting the value because if they're delivering the outcome, that's what you're after, and you've got a cost around it. Which is where I always find it interesting when there's a discussion around output or outcome-based contracting versus T&M, and people naturally make the assumption that an output or an outcome-based contract is going to be more expensive. Quite simply, they don't know how much it's going to cost on a time and materials basis. I always talk about it being kind of like on the never. People feel comfortable in the back of their heads if they think there are people working on X, but they're not thinking about where are the outcomes, which is where I think there's a massive opportunity for organizations to improve their efficiency and get more value out of the services that they buy, but it needs to be linked to their strategy effectively, in the sense that they need to have a clear strategy, they need to communicate it effectively, so that it filters right the way down through the organization, so that an individual buyer knows what the organization is trying to achieve, how what they're doing aligns with that, and therefore what it is they need to achieve, and therefore it makes it easier for them to define an outcome. Obviously, as we said earlier, the value in doing that is greater the more complex the thing it is you're trying to achieve. But it's hard for people to do that. Even if it's a complex service that they're buying, that's something that we see all the time, is organizations or buyers will just think, I don't know where to start, or it's hard to define this. But there are ways to do that in terms of how they can collaborate with procurement to build in the structure and content, and how they can collaborate with suppliers who are the ultimate experts. But it ties back to this point you were making about working in partnership, and actually you're aligning on a common goal. How do we solve this problem?
Yeah, exactly. How do we solve this problem collaboratively? And that's kind of the key. It's not us as the buyer, specifying how something has to be done. It's us specifying a problem, which is the outcome we're trying to achieve. It's the what, and then collaborating together to understand how we get there using supplier expertise, which is where the innovation point comes in. But it's for me, it's like this is the theoretical bit, but it's almost like innovation, sustainability. These are like buzzwords that we throw around, and there's like endless streams of content on social media about, and let's be honest, in a lot of CSR publications as well. But for me, services procurement has like an outsourced role to play in this, because you've got, not only can you drive huge innovation through the way that we contract, but I think we've talked about this before. It's like I also see this model of what used to be a pure goods procurement, as in, perfect example is probably Rolls-Royce. I think we talked about it literally a year ago on the podcast. Is Rolls-Royce used to sell turbine engines to the marine and the airline industry, but decades ago they moved to a model which was completely integrated. So instead of
where all the service and maintenance and everything was built into it.
So it's what they call power by the hour.
Yeah,
so they've got an uptime metric. There's probably thousands of them, but there's effectively they're looking at uptime, because that's truly what the customer cares about. It's how many hours can we get where we're not sitting on the runway waiting for technicians to repair an engine or wait for replacement parts or whatever it is. And what's the maximum amount of time we can spend in the air or transiting through a terminal? And they've incentivized, Rolls-Royce has set up a business model that's incentivized for them to make sure that they've got the right engineers in place, they've got the right inventory around spare parts. Their entire supply chain is geared to make sure that they can meet Boeing or Emirates or whoever the buyer is end goals. And even kind of in the B2C space, from a consumer standpoint, we're starting, Airbnb is effectively, rather than, just another hotel brand, it is hospitality as a service. Spotify is not, it's difficult to compare Spotify or Netflix to Blockbuster. They are entertainment or music as a service. You're no longer paying for a physical CD. You're paying for a subscription to an outcome, which is access to all this.
Entertain me.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's I think we almost take that for granted now. Like the idea of going to a shop, I don't even have a CD player anymore, I'm ashamed to say, but the idea of going out and buying a CD now seems so alien. And yet this technology is 15 years old probably at most. And so I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that. Heat as a service, power as a service, efficiency as a service, whatever it ends up being, because those business outcomes, especially in an environment like we're in today with, energy costs, commercial energy costs going through the roof, these things are going to become so important that businesses are going to have to align service provision to meet their end customer goals rather than just providing utility.
So one thing to drill into a little deeper on that, you mentioned sustainability. So how would you see sustainability being factored into that? Would you see that as being that's part of the objective?
This is the problem with me going off on tangents. So the first thing is, if you look at asset utilization, do we at the moment where we look at buying a good, we're not necessarily looking at using 100% of its capacity all the time. In a sharing economy, it's much less resource intensive to produce the same outcomes or the same, the heat, light, power, whatever it is, or the hospitality or the music or whatever that the end user is looking for. So that's kind of one part. Zipcar, for example, you don't need, they've got a fleet of cars, but they're shared between so many different people that there's rather than sitting in someone's garage, you might be sitting on, a car park lot, but for a tenth of the time. So actually the resource efficiency is a lot higher. And then, therefore you're using a lot less resources for the same outputs, if you like. But it's also a circular economy principle as well. It's servitizing things that would otherwise be a flow of goods through a supply chain. And another part of that as well is minimizing waste. So minimizing the amount of stuff that goes to landfill. These are everything that's required to take things that would otherwise go to landfill and bring them back into the supply chain is service-based. So yeah, again, I'll go off on another tangent unless you
No, I think it's an interesting one, but ultimately it comes back to aligning objectives between the buying organization and the suppliers. And when it comes to things like sustainability, if you look at, like, for example, Scope 3, these type of objectives are, there's a much greater pressure on and incentive to companies to actually, really do meaningful stuff around these objectives. They have to now, and so they should. But that's filtering down into the supply chain, where again, the importance of getting control over and leveraging your services supply chain is incredibly important because of, it's just a bit more, it's generally a bit more vague. And therefore, when these strict controls come into place, it's harder for organizations to get on top of that. But ultimately, what we're saying here is it's all about how you are motivating, what the motivational factors are within the contractual process. So
I can give you one more example. Sorry to interrupt. I'll give you one more example around a very clear example of innovation and sustainability being linked from my own industry. Is if you've got three different high street stores on the road outside here, and you've got a time and materials agreement which incentivizes three different call outs, you might by chance be able to line them up so that you've got less than 3 service engineers fulfilling the same work orders in the same period of time. But if you're not incentivized to do that, there's no guarantee that you would. If you could build that into the contract and you could use density management to make sure that you had the minimum amount of travel time involved in filling out those service requests, you could still make sure that from the service provider's point of view, they've spent less time on the road, they've got less fuel, they've got less time that they're paying to technicians, engineers, etc. But you can still make sure that they are incentivized to make a margin on those job orders, but you've cut travel time down by a third and therefore emissions down by a third. But unless you build that into the agreement, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to achieve that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. It was just someone just poked their head around the door. I've never had that happen before. Come and join us. Yeah, and the thing is with that is it's encouraging sustainability, but it's also allowing the organisation to be more profitable by being more efficient.
Yeah.
So the thing I wanted to come on to next was around contract economics, which, as you describe in your white paper, it sounds very boring, a bit scary, and kind of not really. It doesn't feel like there's much psychology involved in it. But actually, when you drill into it, what it's all about is incentives and trade-offs.
Yeah.
So how do you see those two factors kind of playing into this?
So if you, yeah, I mean, it's the way that the economics of the contract work are all, the first trade-off you've got is how do we trade cost off against value, and then the second part is how the service provider looks at trading off performance against their input costs.
So this is where you get, sorry to interrupt, this is where you get either a linear relationship, or you get a kind of geometric exponential.
In very simple terms, in a time and materials agreement, you've got a one-to-one relationship between cost and performance, or a one to whatever. It's a linear, as you say, it's a linear relationship. What you're looking to do is bend that curve, basically, so that the more that's invested in innovating the contract, the steeper that curve gets. So rather than, at the outset of the contract, it might require more cost because you've got higher fixed costs, because you've got higher investment in technology, people, processes, whatever it is, in the agreement to achieve certain service levels. But to achieve, really high uptime levels, you might need personnel co-located with where the service is being delivered, for example, or you might need certain technologies, Internet of Things, sensors, whatever, that gives you real-time information as to the condition of specific assets. I'm using examples from my own field.
It applies to any service.
Professional services.
Yeah.
You can think of different parallels. But the point is, you kind of, okay, that's a theoretical example. It's a little bit kind of conceptual.
Yeah.
But the point is, you've got it. You can kind of see, right, to achieve really high service levels and to achieve really high service standards is going to require one of two things. It's either going to require you to throw an awful lot of bodies and time and materials at the problem, which is going to be expensive for both parties, and it's going to cap the margin of the service provider, because they're always going to be, there's only so much you can charge in margin for a lot of these contracts. Or you can allow them to use technology and in more innovative ways of delivering that service, etc. You might be able to leverage that across multiple different client groups, whatever it is, to get to that stage. So the density management example earlier on, it could be, as I say, it could be different types capturing different types of information, which allows them to be proactive about how, again, it's specific example, but about how certain assets are maintained, rather than being reactive and waiting for to get feedback from a facilities manager or someone who's on site. And you see this more and more now, increasingly in like the smart buildings sort of area, where you've got just massive amounts of data coming out of these buildings, to the extent that in many cases the real estate manager on site, or the real estate manager responsible for that site, is the building is actually telling them what's going on before they have the chance to figure it out, because there's so much data involved in that. Well, you're never going to get there if the only way that you can make a profit on a contract is by making sure that you've got bums on seats,
and it's taking as long as possible. And as you say, you're using kind of FM examples with some of this, but it applies to any service. Ultimately, you're giving the supplier the opportunity to meet the outcome in the most efficient and effective way that they can, which is going to cause them to rather than just say it's linear, I need as many people on the ground as possible for as long as possible for us to make the best markup on it, versus saying to them, here's the objective, here's the destination you need to get to. How you get there is up to you. If you've got a really clever way of doing that and that saves you a load of cost, good for you. Yeah. I'm still getting what I need for the cost that I'm accepting up front, and that makes sense to me. So it's just, I mean, the word you used, hamper, rather than a nice picnic, the kind of thing that gets in the way and stops organisation suppliers from innovating. It's absolutely true, because it's just, where's the motivation to do that? It's I always find it frustrating in organisations, as I think I mentioned this earlier, when you see bright people being hired and then just told what to do. Like, what's the point in hiring bright people and not letting them work stuff out for themselves?
Yeah, that's absolutely. And you can scale that across an entire organisation. You can kind of see how those time and materials contracts in the wrong context. It's a sort of that's not a relationship between partners. That's a relationship of subservience.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's that. There's also the fact that some of it is just basic maths. I mean, if you look at what's happening with e-commerce, for example, right? You're taking high street stores where there used to be one in every market town. You might be centralizing them in major parts of the country. Then you're increasingly reliant on warehouses, but even more so now on data centers. So you've got these large, hyperscale right down to co-located data centers all over the place, crunching massive amounts of data. And the challenge is, if you get a service outage in a high street store, and a couple of lights goes out, it's a little bit too hot, whatever, it's an issue. It's not the end of the world. If you get similar issues around temperature control, humidity, whatever it is in a data center, that's firstly is a problem, because you're going to have energy efficiency issues around operating that. But also, if you have a power outage, people are going to be, if you're in a high street store, people will probably be, unless it's something too disastrous, might even be an opportunity for comedy. But if it's in a data center, you're talking about the average outage in a data center is about $750,000 cost.
Wow.
So you can kind of see how it doesn't really matter how much you're paying people to be physically present on site if something like that occurs, and it just there's an astronomical penalty to be paid for not managing performance.
So where we're getting to is that used in the wrong context, time and materials might seem like a cheap and effective and easy way to do something, but it's a false economy.
Yeah, if you don't understand the total cost of ownership, you will always come back to when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You really need to understand what all the costs involved in that service delivery are relative to the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Because you can kind of look at that example alone. If you have just one or two instances of that over a 5-year period, it's probably wiped out all the potential costs you could have made from negotiating down rates for, it's a terrible example because no one actually does this, but you can kind of see why.
Well, it's the effort reward thing, isn't it? Where if at a level of complexity, a level of importance, it makes sense to spend the time up front.
Yeah.
It becomes more strategic, and therefore it makes sense to take a strategic approach to it.
Yeah. And I think I got waylaid a little bit talking about the economics of contracting earlier on. But the other thing which is fascinating to me is, and this is getting, I think, more and more kind of in the sort of academic space, it is getting more and more attention from procurement, the procurement kind of knowledge base, whatever you like, is game theory.
Right.
Just an amazing fascinating area to study by itself.
There's two elements to that, isn't there?
Yeah, broadly speaking, you can have a competitive game, which is like, a game of chess. We've both got different objectives, and we're both trying to use strategy to like win the game. And my win is your loss, and your win is my loss. Or you've got cooperative games, which is like the classic example would be like the prisoner's dilemma. So you have two criminals who are arrested for the same crime, but they don't know what the other one's going to do, and so they've got to kind of figure out how the other one's going to behave, and based on that, minimize the sentence that we're going to get. And the Nash equilibrium result is always you've got to assume good faith on behalf of the other party, or the second best choice on behalf of the other party, basically.
So effectively, that's saying that collaboration statistically leads to a greater outcome, better outcome.
But also, the greater sharing of information, the better outcome for both parties as well. So it's also, and that's another problem that we can kind of see everywhere, is we're siloed enough within organizations, but let alone between buyers and service providers. So sharing of information is a kind of key way to achieve the outcomes of both parties. Shielding that information around intellectual property protection, etc., and figuring out ways to hold that information close to your chest is, in theory and in practice, a way to kind of hamper innovation, to reduce that. But also with the competitive example, we set up agreements with the best of intentions, but as soon as you start getting a breakdown of in a relationship that's not truly collaborative, right? It goes back to the chess example. If you make a move, and I'm now going to be trying to figure out how to move based on what I think your strategy is. If I don't take that in good faith, if the game's competitive as opposed to cooperative, then the relationship starts to break down, because I start realizing, right, I've got to protect myself rather than work to the benefit of the relationship, if you like. But anyway, going on.
It's really interesting. That will, I think that's one of the things that I find really fascinating about the content you put out. It's the introduction of the kind of theoretical and the academic principles behind some of the stuff that's going on. And it's really valid, and at first glance, you look at it and go, game theory, what the hell's that got to do with this? But it's got everything to do with it. If a contractual relationship is a win-loss setup, then that's probably not going to really build a brilliant relationship. And there's probably not going to be, a massive attempt to deliver value on the supplier side, because they're not incentivized to do that. They're just incentivized to do certain things, whether that's, bums on seats or whatever it might be. But where it can be a collaborative approach, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about being aligned towards a common objective. Strategically, that's where you get into this. You're getting much more into the situation where it is an extended capacity and extended part of your organization, which is, it's where it's going. As you say, the core organizations are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and more concentrated around things like, what is this organization? Well, it's the brand. And what does that brand mean? What's its purpose in the world? What's it all about? And actually then there's a core function around that. But in terms of managing the rapid rate of change and the uncertainty in this VUCA era, you need to have the flexibility to scale up, scale down, bring in new capabilities rapidly. It doesn't always mean you're going to that you have to hire them. That's not always necessarily the best way to do it. So by having a trusted services supply chain, and obviously a full supply chain, flexibility around that and visibility on it, you can manage things like, how sustainable is my supply chain? How diverse is my supply chain? What innovation potential do I have in my supply chain? Have I got smaller suppliers that can maybe think differently and do things differently? If you can engage that, your whole supply chain or the parts of your supply chain where it's relevant on a collaborative basis, then it is that extended supply chain is acting as part of your organization. You're acting as one unit towards a common objective. So it's just a different, more kind of developed principle, but there's a massive amount of value to it. And I think the stuff you were talking about earlier, what was the lady whose concept was the relational contracting?
Kate Vitasek.
So you mentioned the Dell and FedEx example, and I seem to remember from the white paper, the outcome of that was that there was an overall 40% cost saving. So Dell win, But FedEx won as well. They got the long-term business. They were making, great margins on what they were delivering because they were bought into the overall objective, solving the problem, and they were able to use innovation to make that a profitable enterprise for them as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's just the cost savings is the simplest example in the world, and it's that's at face value. That's what procurement is there to do. And you've got an example there of using a collaborative approach to drive savings that you would never in a million years think you were going to be able to get from a transactional kind of, a short-term negotiation.
So I want to come on to space in a minute. But before we do that, so just looking at the performance side of things, that ties into that relational contracting in a way, but there's differences in the way that you can measure performance and different things that you might be measuring. It could be an input, it could be an output, or it could be an outcome. What's your view on that from a kind of performance management angle?
I think it's almost like when you go, I kind of see them as, again, on a spectrum from inputs probably being the easiest to manage, but that's the furthest distance probably from what the actual objectives of the enterprise are, through to outcomes probably potentially being the most difficult to manage, depending on what the actual service is being provided.
Yeah.
It also requires probably the strongest collaboration between the two parties, but it's the most closely aligned to what the end users, the enterprise, whoever's actually experiencing that service at the end of the day is looking for is. Then outputs to me are just, that's the flip side of the inputs. So you might have someone turning up for a certain amount of time on site, but the response time to get there and the different parameters are around the service they're delivering, that can be managed on an individual transactional level. So that might be a single work order, a single job order. You might have an input and an output from that instance, but the outcome is whatever's you might be customer satisfaction, might be room utilization,
power by the hour.
Yeah, there you go. So that's all on that spectrum. I think the challenge is, I think Andrew Carpy was talking about this on a podcast he did with you ages ago, is across the kind of source to pay, this source to pay workflow, if you like, the source to contract bit needs to be set up so that you've got the right contract parameters and the right performance parameters right there. But oftentimes you can do that and not have the procure to pay, contract to pay, whatever you call it, the end bit of that, set up in a way that actually manages the parameters you've set out at the start of that relationship. So it's impractical to do that on every contract. So if you've got agreements where you are looking for specific outcomes, again, the strategic, the top right of that quadrant, that kind of makes sense. But it all comes back to what's the strategy of at an enterprise level, which contracts are you going to look at utilizing different contract models for, and then building performance metrics off the back of that. But there's a concept in IT, I think we might have talked about this before, about the watermelon effect.
Yeah.
Which is, so you've got, if you're measuring on inputs, but your end user's looking at outcomes, further the distance that is, the more chance you've got of having everything look good when you're looking at the supplier's performance against a contract, but everything obviously being perceived a lot more negatively if the actual result that the end user is looking for isn't there, if you like. So the performance management bit is probably the trickiest of all of this, because it's all great in theory, but when the rubber hits the road, you actually got to make sure that you've got governance around contract management, which in many cases isn't, even in quite complex agreements, isn't in place.
Yeah, it's in my opinion the biggest gap in services versus the procurement of goods and materials. Are there clearly defined outputs that are defined within that contract, and is that contract stored digitally? Quite often not. So there might be some milestones or deliverables contained within that. Let's call it a statement of work. But if that's just a scanned in PDF in a contract repository somewhere, then that's kind of lost in the process. It's fixed at that point. Clearly, with most services, they're going to change along the way. And one of the things I was going to bring up was that sometimes the first part of a service delivery might be to define what the actual outcome needs to be. If you bring in a consulting arrangement, for example, you don't always know where you need to get to. Sometimes you need to do an initial piece of work to define what it is you need to do. So the measurement of an outcome or an output is only going to happen effectively if there's something there tangible to be measured, if there's a way of administrating that and a way of kind of capturing that digitally in an ideal world. And the other side of performance, which is really worth considering, is it's got to have the qualitative considerations around it as well. As you said, if there are quantitative metrics that are in place, if you capture that digitally, you can look at how a supplier is performing. Did they hit their milestones? Were they on time, on budget? How much did the scope change? So that's one side of it. But then, okay, they might have hit all of their milestones, but the level of satisfaction for the buyer might be very, very low. They were a nightmare to deal with. Their communication was terrible. They didn't bring in the level of diversity that we wanted involved in this project. They were using lower level consultants when we were promised high level, whatever it may be. If that's not captured as well, not factored into it, and that's where I think artificial intelligence, I was talking to you earlier about how that can help with the performance management side of it, when you're bringing all of these qualitative and quantitative metrics into play and weighting them and scoring suppliers, that's when you can get into the real magic of being able to compare services suppliers on a like-for-like basis. Are they hitting the quantitative metrics that they should be for the desired outputs and outcomes of what they're working on? And are they delivering satisfaction on whatever those qualitative metrics are that are important to that particular organization? Then you could compare suppliers doing totally different things as to, are they providing value as a supplier? And obviously, once you start to break that down per category, then you can build that into your kind of strategic planning as to what suppliers you might use in particular areas in the future. So when there's difference in measuring performance, whether you're measuring an input, an output, or an outcome. Now, I've had it said to me before that in certain areas, Johnny, it's pretty much impossible to measure an outcome in that area. You could only measure an output, because in some areas, some people would argue that it's so hard to pin down what it is you're doing, or maybe the start of a process, that you have to stick to your outputs. But in the ideal world, everything would be around an outcome. So outcomes and outputs, I feel that there's still value in outputs driving innovation, maybe not to the maximum possible level on your scale of it being an overarching outcome where there's this massive amount of freedom for the supplier to say, well, let us go away and think about that, and we'll do it the way that we think is best. There's still this scale where at an input level, there's no incentive for innovation, no, not really any. You're not asking for innovation at that point. Just saying, just do what I've asked you for that rate. When you get to outputs, I think there's still the potential for innovation at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I suppose the challenge is when you're measuring performance based on outcomes from the supplier's point of view, often those outcomes won't be entirely within their control. So there's the more of a kind of outcome based metric you're looking at. That could be, asset uptime. It could be.
What about in a consulting arrangement though? So I think when you're looking at, like, in the FM industry in particular, that outcome is possibly easier to define. But if you take that on a broader services context, if you're looking at a consulting arrangement, the outcome might not be. It's a difficult one to define, because you could look at it and go, the outcome, there should always be a clear outcome, because it should align with what you need to achieve strategically within your organization. But I think if you look at it in the context of a consulting arrangement, the outputs of that might be a report that feeds into a more developed view of what the outcome needs to be, like sprints in an agile process.
Right, I like that. So you could have. I'm kind of thinking about it like, well, yeah, as you're kind of developing scope for a project, all of the deliverables and all the objectives that you're putting in place for the project should have a tangible, value-based
endpoint.
Yeah.
Result.
Increased profitability, enhanced employee retention, whatever. You can make it, depending on what the field is. There should be something tangible that the that the buyer or the stakeholder that's procuring those services is looking to get out of that. They could be personal metrics or they could be organizational metrics, but there should be something tangible to that. But if not, and you're looking at an early stage, it's almost like discovery projects to try and feel out what that outcome is going to look like. Then maybe, like what you're saying, where you use kind of an agile methodology and you say, right, we know that the finish line, we can sort of see the finish line, but it's a little bit blurry. But we can see the 100-yard line, to use like a sports analogy. So we can at least set that up.
Yeah.
Maybe that's outcome based, and maybe it builds into a broader project. The honest answer is I don't know.
Ultimately, you're driving towards the clearest definition possible of the end point. But at a minimum level, if you can define where you need to get to next, then it's an output or it's a mini outcome. And ultimately, that's still putting sharing the risk and it's sharing the responsibility with the supplier. If you take that approach through that type of contracting mechanism, that shared risk and shared responsibility is going to lead that supplier to be motivated to do it, to use innovation and get it done in the best way, use initiative to get it done in the most effective way, which will make it as profitable as possible for them, best possible outcome for you as the customer, and ideally the best relationship when you've got a trusted problem solver as part of your extended organization. So just to wrap things up, because we could probably go at this for a decent amount of time. Innovation. I made a note to myself that innovation lives in space. So within your white paper, and it's a bit of a challenge here as to whether you can remember every part of that acronym. Talk to me a little bit about that in terms of fostering innovation.
Right. So I think, it was a nice acronym, but basically what I was saying, I think, was at the outset, we've talked about many of these points already, but at the outset, you want to understand that the contract needs to match the level of risk and value to the organization. So that's a segmentation piece. We use the Kralitch matrix in procurement all the time, understanding where strategic, leverage, your bottleneck, and your tactical transactional suppliers sit. It doesn't make sense to have a misalignment between your segmentation and your contract type, because otherwise you end up over-investing in something that's not going to produce the value and the innovation that you want. So that's the first piece. Second piece was, I know A was agreement. Can't remember quite what P was off the top of my head.
Was it partnership? Was it? I don't.
Possibly. But I think broadly speaking, I'm talking about A. You've got to understand from a category standpoint, or from a high level standpoint, where each of these service agreements or each of these categories are going to fit within that kind of portfolio of categories you've got. That's the first piece. The second bit was really around using the agreement, designing it up front to meet the outcomes you're trying to achieve, but also not doing what we do 90% of the time, which is sign an agreement, throw it over the walls to the business, stick it in a filing cabinet, and then forget about it. It should be a template and a roadmap for driving the relationship. So in the case that TfL and Cubic Transportation, that those SLAs in the contract and the terms, the terms that were in the agreement between FedEx and DHL, that's their roadmap. That's what they're using to drive day-to-day decision making, as opposed to just having it there as a reference guide when you need it. No, that's an actual a route to achieving what you need to in the relationship. C, I think, was really around collaboration, which I think is another point I stole from Kate Tacit, which is the governance structure around the contract. Once everything's put in place, has to be there to make sure that it stays on course and doesn't drift into the position where you're getting into competitive game theory rather than cooperative. So you've got to have
getting into conflict at that point.
Yeah. So the right level of seniority involved, the right level of performance management. You've got to have an understanding of how conflict gets resolved, because conflict's inevitable regardless of which kind of relationship you're in. So you need to have a proactive approach to governing the actual contract and making sure that it achieves the aims that you're trying to at the outset, and you're getting what you need to in terms of value and innovation from it. And then the final point I think was on how it's executed and rolled out, but also just as importantly, how you can exit from it. So you need to have a plan from the outset of not an assumption that the relationship lasts forever, but at some point, one or both parties may realize that they want to change course, part ways, whatever, and you need a way to enable both parties to exit from the contract without one of them taking undue risk. So that's not, again, the termination for convenience clause is a pretty.
You had the quote in there that was like, "There's no way I'm going to take on a 60-day termination for convenience clause if the contract's not going to be profitable in 2 months. It's just an unacceptable business risk."
Yeah, so I can't remember.
It was a CFO. Yeah,
but that's straight from the horse's mouth. That's like you can't put capital into an agreement where you can have the rug pulled out from underneath you at a moment.
It's just too much risk. Yeah.
So that's kind of, I still forget the P, but you get the point.
Well, I would definitely recommend that people check out the full white paper. I found it really, really interesting and very thought-provoking. It introduced some concepts to me that I either wasn't aware of or hadn't really considered very much, and I can see your curiosity going into that, and I think the fact that it takes that kind of scientific and academic approach is really valuable, and I think it's great content. I guess the question is, what's next?
I have no idea. I've got a couple of other things where I was, as I say, I was kind of partway through a master's degree, and I've got a lot of content for that I think it would be good to try and make a much more relevant, bring in some real world examples and put out some short form content around that as well. So yeah, especially around the sustainability piece, I'm really trying to understand how the services, servitization, and the circular economy bit all kind of fits together, because I think there's sort of emergent business models that we're seeing, especially in the B2C space, that in 10 years' time are going to be even more commonplace in our industry. And I think the more we can kind of understand exactly how they work and what our role is in them, the more value we can get out of them.
And the faster we can bring them into play.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've got a major challenge. Like, we've got, whether it's emissions targets or just the sustainability agenda in general, we've got big mountains to climb. So
definitely. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. Love that chat. I can feel a potential future chat coming up around this sustainability in the circular economy. I think it's some really interesting concepts that you touched on briefly around that. But yeah, just a pleasure to chat, and really nice to be able to meet up in person. So thanks very much.
That's been fun. Thank you.
Excellent.